Looks like we're in the technical terminology 5x5. So good. We are live. Well, in just a few minutes, Jared will be joining us today, and a surprise guest here or there will join as well. But we're going to be discussing really the Hebrew Bible. There's a lot of different terminologies, and I'm going to go into that, I hope, as well as we kind of break down conversationally aspects of the Old Testament text, Genesis to Malachi, if you're using one of the arrangements, to kind of lay everything out, and why it's a reliable box of information. But before we get to that, we'll start that at the top of the hour. Jared, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I've got Hadassah, my oldest daughter, at the office with me for a little while. My youngest has got a therapy appointment, so I've got her. She's pretty excited. She's a little bored at this point. We've been here for a while, and she's ripped through all of her schoolwork and is like, "Hey, when are we going home?" And I was like, "Not super soon, kid." So sorry about that. She may make an appearance in a little bit and say hi to everybody. But I'm doing great. Still got a little bit of freedom before school starts back, and I am I would say reveling in it, but I don't know if you can count like trying to get ready for school as reveling in not being in school. So who knows?
You're rejoicing in your modest freedom.
Exactly.
Is probably
exactly.
one way to think about it. We've been doing this last while. Just simple questions. And in the last couple of weeks, Jared, what was one small thing that just brought joy to your day? I think there's some different things we can look at life in positive ways, and we really need that in our personal work and in the relationships we have. So what you got?
Well, one thing you were mentioning earlier, right before we began, Christmas presents or presents for the holiday season. And Abigail, my youngest, who's 5, she's really big into Zelda. All of our family is pretty big into Zelda. And so my parents-in-law got her 3 little stuffed animals that come from the Zelda universe. And one was very obvious. It was Princess Zelda. The other was Link. And she was all about them. And she got a third, which is a very, very niche character from one of the old N64 games. And she was like, "I have no clue who this is. Don't care about it at all." And then like 30 minutes later, she realized who he was. And now she like sleeps with all 3 of them across her chest and
Nice.
like loves them all. So it's pretty hilarious. We sent a picture of that to her grandfather who found those out, and he was pretty excited about that. So just the shift in terms of how that played out was pretty funny.
Cool. And those little joyful things are actually something that we need in life. We need to have a little bit of reflection on good stuff, even as much as there's value in pondering failure and negative experiences. I don't know if I can make it happen, but up there on the back, you can see a little art piece that was given to me that I just fantastically
Is that
love.
a portrait of you?
Yes, it's a self-portrait. No, it's a standard butcher's diagram that shows where cuts of meat might be upon a glorious pig. And the artist that produced it wrote in each of those sections, nom, 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 nom. Clearly indicating to all that is, everything is good about a pig. That's where you get bacon from, that's where you get pork from. So, hey, I can't deny that was just a great little tiny moment that brought joy for me, for sure. So it's just about time for us to begin. I want to kind of break down a couple things before we start. I also want to identify that Terry can't be with us today. He's got some responsibilities that he needs to do today, and so maybe he'll pop in and ask some questions, maybe he won't, but we will miss him. He was going to be our Hebrew fact checker for today, and so he's not going to be serving in that role. Anyway, for our broadcast, as we kick off this new year, there's 2 guests that are going to be joining us. Jared is for today, and Jeff Wilson will join us next week. And as part of the larger work for Do the Work this year, we're trying to emphasize some key teaching tools that will help evangelists, elders, deacons, and parents equip the people in their lives to be more prepared for challenges to their faith. It's not just evidences, but that will probably come up at different points, but also matters of the accuracy of the New Testament and Old Testament texts, like today and next week, issues that deal with challenging moral matters and ways that we can do a better job of preparing in advance rather than responding without any kind of understanding. And we'll see those unfold over the course of the year. For this week and next week, the subject's really simple. First, first key point for us is that A, do we have a reliable text block for the Old Testament? And B, how do we teach that? Not Corona, just little allergies. That's the standard rule.
Cough for Corona.
Yeah. But Jared, why don't we start off? We talked about a few things, and I think it's important to kind of lay a little of that groundwork out.
Yeah, so there's two really distinct poles on this question that you ask, which is, can we trust the Hebrew scriptures? Can we trust what's in our Old Testament? And on one side, we've got the super easy answer, which is yes. And we can just kind of get that out of the way at the very beginning. The answer is undoubtedly, absolutely, positively yes. But exactly how that looks on the other side, we could go way, way far on the other side and explain in just minute detail. I laughed a little bit when you said, it's a really simple question. It's a simple question. How we get there is a little bit more complex. And so trying to find the right kind of spot on that number line in terms of how we go through things is the more complicated situation, because so much of the case in evidences books, or if you pick up an apologetics book, or if you're a preacher or if you're a member and you get handed a book on like apologetics, or even if it mentions text criticism at all, it probably talks almost exclusively about the New Testament and says something like, hey, the Masoretes counted every consonant and the halfway mark, and let's talk more about the New Testament. Because really, although it's not exactly true, but in some ways, before we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, which really didn't happen until after World War II, and then it kind of took this 40-year lag really of getting them all out, and we're still getting them all translated and collated and brought new things, we couldn't really talk about this question of the text criticism of the Bible and how we get the Hebrew Bible and how we get the Old Testament as well. And we're all kind of playing catch up on this idea in a lot of ways. So it's a little confusing at times in little pieces for how to deal with it.
Yeah, I think for me, one of my earliest introduction to questions about the manuscripts was simplified to, the differences are really like punctuation marks. Like that was how it was explained. And to a certain degree, there's some validity in that statement, although it is kind of really softening a lot of the middle space that exists between these two polar perspectives that Jared pointed out. Let me also add a great kind of basket of information exists about this subject. And so if someone who's watching or participating has questions, please go ahead and ask those. We may not be able to direct you to immediate answers, but there's some really great recent research that is now gone through this process. Jared talks about like what's going on. And let me simplify it from my perspective, because I'm not a language guy. I love the English language and I love languages and I try to do my very best with them, but I'm not a scholar in Hebrew, Greek, or ancient Near East languages by any means. So when we find a new document of any kind from antiquity, it takes a long time for it to first start being talked about publicly in academic circles. And then those academics will write academic journal articles, which are a little bit more accessible to people like me. I can read those journal articles and understand them, but I couldn't necessarily translate the original manuscript. But then that journal article gets thinned out in a more understandable, clear and precise way at maybe an academic standard level, and then finally at a devotional level. When it hits a devotional level, then it's really accessible to folks like me and maybe others who are participating. And from my devotional level, it might appear in bulletin articles, sermons, and other situations. What's taken that 40-year, 50-year, 60-year cycle since World War II is that process has finally started to wash the ocean of information in these manuscripts to the shores of your sermons. And so now this stuff is more accessible, and it's a big deal. So with that, we're looking at that now. We can look at the Old Testament and realize, hey, there's a lot of variability in these manuscripts, but the variability proves the reliability, because you can look at those differences and say, hey, look, this one came later and here's why it's different. And this one was earlier and here's why it's the same. We want more copies and even more variability, because we can say, okay, this one's weird. Want more, we didn't have a lot of that.
Yeah, when we had kind of one thing and you either accepted it or you rejected it, but you couldn't really do a lot with it. But now we've got these comparisons. You know, it's like you get one of these pictures that says, hey, spot the differences.
Yeah.
And if I ask you, hey, spot the differences, and you've got one picture, you can't, right? It's impossible. There's nothing to compare it to. But when we have more copies and we have more examples, then all of a sudden we can kind of start tracing these things back. One way you can kind of think about this process, some people kind of call text criticism, it's reverse engineering what we have to find what was original or most likely to be original, or what was most likely to be probably the best way to think about it. What's the Bible that Jesus used in the first century? That's something that's attainable. Moving too much before then is really difficult because we just don't have anything that's older than that. But that's attainable, and that's something that we can do. And I think that's a really great goal that we can have and that we can teach and show that we have got confidence in the Bible that Jesus used.
Yeah, and I think that kind of connection of recognizing, hey, this is the scriptures that were available to Jesus, the same scriptures that were available to Paul, to Peter, to the disciples of the first century. And they, at times, would pull from the Septuagint. They would pull from the other manuscripts of religious writing that were available. Should we take a little time to talk about like the world they lived in, maybe, to kind of get a little better picture? Jared and I talked ahead of time about the Second Temple period, and how that's really where we're getting most of this manuscript evidence from, and have almost always gotten most of our manuscript from. We just got another trove of it about 60 years ago. So Jared, why don't you give like a little thimble full of information? We've got our goals. We've got to explain it, and then in the end, talk about principles to teach when we get down to it.
Yeah, so a lot of times when we think about Jews living in Palestine, Judea, Galilee, right? And these are all kind of distinct little areas in the first century, we think, oh, they all spoke Hebrew. Well, probably not, actually. Most of them would have spoken Aramaic, which is a cousin to Hebrew. But more importantly, most of them, certainly people living in Galilee like Jesus, would have also spoken Greek. They might not could have written it, but they could have spoken Greek. And there's even evidence in the Bible that Jesus and people from Galilee would have spoken a little bit of Latin as well. So you've got these people, and a lot of them are speaking 2 to 3 languages. And they're not just using the Hebrew Bible in their synagogues, which are kind of their meeting places, their houses of prayer, not just to the temple, but when they would meet normally outside of the festivals, they would go to these synagogues. And at the synagogues, you would have a reading every Sabbath, and the reading was coming from a specific portion, following a specific sort of progression. And though it's a question, an open question any given week, are we going to be reading a Hebrew text this week? Are we going to be reading a Greek text this week? We know from the beginning of Luke, in Luke chapter 4, when he goes into the synagogue, he picks up a text to read, and he quotes from Isaiah 61, and the text he reads from is not from a Hebrew text. It's from a Greek text. And so we've got all these different little differentiations that are present there in the first century, and they've got all these different scrolls that are present, and they don't really have Bibles the way we think of it. It's a collection of scrolls. I think the verse you used for the introduction to this, right, bring me the scrolls and the parchments, probably speaking about what we would think of as biblical texts. Yeah. That's kind of what it looks like. Everybody's got all these different things, and they're kind of collecting them as they've got them because it's expensive to make them. But everybody wants to know and to hear and to read the Bible. But most people don't have a copy.
Right, and so that's something that's a little bit challenging on the quick emotional level to understand, that not everybody could open up their device and boom, they've got 16 translations of these texts available to them. Frankly, you couldn't do that 20 years ago. The computer programs that existed 20 years ago could barely struggle to do that at the same time. So there's a big shift there, like massive change in our ability to connect to the text. So since our focus is the Genesis to Malachi text, which is just the various ways to talk about the Old Testament, Although a lot of folks also will say that's the Hebrew Bible. Perfectly appropriate way to talk about it. Although when you use that term, you're probably also including a different layout and maybe some extra books. And so there's reasons why you would want to use each of those phrases. But I think most folks are familiar with the Old Testament, and that's what we're probably going to keep using for today for this purpose, to say this is the text we're talking about. This is the text block. When we talk about that, in the Bibles that you and I might use, what is actually taking place in the sense of what manuscripts are typically being used in short form? How are those then approached? And then how do we end up at an English translation in 2 minutes go?
Yeah. So you open up your Old Testament right now in a Protestant Bible. Okay. Now this is going to be different if you're Orthodox or something like that. But you open up your ESV, your NIV, your KJV, your CSB, your alphabet soup Bible, right? Then it is going to be based strongly on a text called a text that is in Hebrew called the Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is a text itself strongly based on the Aleppo Codex, which is the earliest complete Hebrew Bible present. And this earliest Hebrew Bible is from about 900 AD. 1 second, my wife just got here to pick up Hadassah. Hadassah, you can run out and see Mom. So you don't have to stay around anymore. You want to wave and say goodbye to everybody else?
Bye.
Thanks for being here. Love you.
Yep.
All right.
And everyone just got less cute.
Everybody got less cute. Phil, sorry.
Yeah,
Me,
it
sorry,
is
right? So it's based on this really incredible text written by the Masoretes, who then have copied it all the way back to when the text stabilized, somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd century AD, and that goes back all the way to the time of Jesus. But what you'll also see in your text today is occasionally, not too often, but sometimes, especially in the book of Samuel, you'll open it up and it'll say, some translations read this, or the Septuagint reads this, or the Samaritan Pentateuch reads this. And that's because already here, we're starting to get more information, and we don't have to solely base it off this one manuscript anymore. We have better evidence, and so slowly we're changing things. I would expect that in the next 20 years, we're going to see a lot more changes in our English Bibles, because in 20 years, they've been saying it's been coming out for the past 20, but in 20 more years, there's going to be a new Hebrew Bible that's out, and then all the translations will be based on that.
And some buzzwords. We're going to answer Edwin's question in a second, at least try to. When we say codex, we're saying that this is a collection of books that they believe is complete at the time it was compiled. And so there's a number of things that are referred to as codexes. And so whenever you're talking about these manuscripts, if someone says this came from a certain codex, it means at the time it was gathered, they thought it was complete. Now, they could be right or wrong about it, but that's how they perceived it to be, and we're still treating it that way, that it was complete for their day.
And also that it's bound in what we would think of as a book. As opposed to being a scrolls, it's in a book, which makes a big difference. So.
Right, and so with that, that means we're using that as a standard to start from. And there may be variations, and that codex is, like Jared has pointed out, is connected to other codexes or other manuscripts. And so Edwin's question ties into this a little bit. He says that he couldn't pick up a device and get 16 different translations, but it does seem they were working with different translations, right? Is there something we can learn about using different translations today from that? And on a sense of our goals, my answer is yeah. Don't be afraid of translated texts. They're totally awesome and sometimes very helpful. At least on my quick answer to that, we can learn that it's a value thing, because translation is art. It is not science in the sense of math, where one word always makes the exact same usage in another language. Jared, anything else on that, to Edwin's question real quick?
Yeah, I would say that, a lot of times today, and there's a good part of this question, a bad part of this question, not Edwin's question. It's all good, right, Edwin? I don't need another phone call late at night. Well, that's fine. I'm just picking on Edwin for a second. But the difference between the translations of the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and the Hebrew Bible, are so much greater than any of the differences of any of our texts, that a lot of times people who know this, when people are arguing about like what's the best translation, oh, if you use the NIV, you're a terrible person. You can only use the ESV or the ASV or the NASB or the whatever else. They're all wonderful. You can get to heaven using any of those translations. And the differences, and those are differences that are important, right? Like I love talking about how we should translate specific things, but we shouldn't lose the forest for the trees, which is they're all great. And we see that even in antiquity. Paul's not really fussed about using a Greek translation or Hebrew translation. He uses a translation that makes it the most clear. And I think that's probably a good reason for us is read multiple translations, see which one helps the most.
Yeah, to simplify, if English translations existed in this little tiny space, the translations differences, the textual differences between the text that Jared's talking about exist within this space.
And sometimes they're out here.
Sometimes you can't even see as being so. And there's reasons for that are highly technical or maybe more nuanced than an individual verse may be reflected in. And so all the English, even the ones that maybe I don't think are that stellar, still exist within this narrow band because they're typically working off the same codexes and the same manuscript compilations. And so they're not really working off of the vast difference that exists between these larger different language aspects. So in the Old Testament in particular, that is an area where there's probably even more consensus up till now on that manuscript text block because of access. I want to also point this out. Jared talked about the oldest Hebrew Codex. It's really important to recognize while the Hebrew is awesome and certainly valuable, and you can see these interplays in language in a little bit different sense, our oldest manuscripts are not Hebrew. Which is different than a codex. We'll talk about that in a second. Our oldest manuscripts live firmly in the last edges of the Second Temple period, and they tend to be Greek as their major basis. It doesn't mean we don't have Hebrew manuscripts. It just are the earliest ones tend to go to this earlier time frame, which is probably valuable because it's more recent to the events. It doesn't mean it's better, but it can be. Let's talk about that for a second, because that's a question that comes up. People say, well, why are they changing my translation? Why didn't they know this beforehand? My King James is great. What's wrong with sticking with it? That's a struggle for folks that I think is in this same space. So let's talk about that for a second.
So first of all, I think the King James Bible is an incredible translation. It is an actual technical marvel for when it came out. It's incredible. It's amazing. The fact that what they used to get what they did when they did it is an enormous blessing. And people who say, look, the only one I can use right now is King James, hey, you can go to heaven using the King James Version. That said, through the providence and grace and gift and blessings of God, we're able to and are blessed to have now a better understanding of the text than they did. And I'll leave this for Jeff to talk about, but I mean, the way we got the King James Bible, if you kind of peel back enough layers, is basically a guy's like, hey buddy, any of y'all have some Greek manuscripts you can send me? Oh yeah, I've got this in my closet. It's kind of pulled together as a hodgepodge. But now we have so many more. We're talking thousands of fragments just from the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. We have 972 things that are large enough to call manuscripts and not just fragments. And we know more about how this works. And so as we learn more, then we're going to have to change some things. It's the same as our faith, right? Imagine you first became a Christian. When you first became a Christian, Phil, have you changed your mind about anything? Have you changed your living? Have you changed your practices? Well, what happened? Well, it's not that the Bible, not the Word of God changed, but your understanding of what comprised the Word of God changed. And that's the same thing that's happening with the manuscripts as we discover more of them.
I think it's also important to point this out, and I think Jared and I are pretty uniformly agreed on this, that the Old Testament is an underread part of our messages from God. It is the Bible that goes from Genesis to Revelation for what we're talking about here, and we don't read enough from Genesis to Malachi. However you want to format it in your reading plans, spend a little bit more time not only reading it well, but seeking to meditate and contextually understand it better. Because I think one of the common questions that come up, and we're going to shift our focus just slightly now as we move from what we're talking about to how we teach it, is this impact phase. And this is one of the reasons why these next two Tuesday sessions exist. In my experience, and Jared probably can talk about some of his, for young believers, and I'm going to say right now, middle school and up as our starting point period, one of the biggest challenges that come to a person who is conscientiously trying to understand their faith, not talking about moral drive, where they are enticed by rebellious behavior, but conscientiously they're trying to build their faith. They have a lunch table conversation with someone who says something like, well, you know that your Old Testament Bible story you're talking about was actually written by somebody in 800 AD. Like, those are the kind of questions that come up that challenge someone who is unprepared. Because if you've never heard that conversation day, you can respond it with dismissiveness. That's not right. You can respond with, wait a minute, I was told that my Old Testament Bible is the same thing that Paul used. And any kind of space between that and the true reality creates a crack that then is either filled with the world, filled with sophistry, or filled with problems. And so that's where we kind of like the teaching side. We've got to teach in a way that prepares for that rather than, oh no, what happened? Now what?
Yeah, and I think this is such a crucial aspect. And this is true whether we're talking about this aspect of the Bible, text criticism, which is kind of this picayune, kind of up in the clouds in some ways sort of a thing. But it's true of everything else. And that is, if we're not prepared to answer questions, we can either shut them down because we don't want to look like we haven't thought about this, or it's too big for us. But that means we can introduce these ideas sooner. And at the basis, what we want to understand is at least some sort of an idea of how we got our Bible, of the problems and the strengths of what we have, and be honest about where we don't know. Because look, faith exists in the distance between what we don't know and what we believe, right? And that just doesn't have to be an enormous gap, but we're never going to know everything. Then it would be faith. But we need to have a faith that is based on reason, and a faith that is based on evidence, and a faith that is strong enough to withstand the storms of life and questions of well-meaning and ill-meaning interlocutors that we've got. And I think one really good way to do that is by talking about how we've got our Bible and the things that make it up, and this kind of stuff that we're trying to introduce to us now.
Yeah, and let's see. I want to start with some little possibilities. I apparently had the wrong thing ready to go. There we go. So what this is a small work by Neil Lightfoot entitled "How We Got the Bible." I'm going to give a couple caveats about it so that people understand it's where it lives. It is not a highly technical work. It is also a slight bit dated in that it doesn't have some of the things that Jared and I are kind of bringing up in the most recent manuscript issues. But with those two caveats, it is very accessible. That means it's because it's not very technical. Although it does cover history and it does cover some of these details, I think it's a good starting point into a subject that can get as deep as you want it to be. Another value of this is that you do not need to be a Greek or Hebrew scholar by any means to understand what Lightfoot is trying to explain, because his primary goal is to start the conversation on how we got a solid English translation of the scriptures. And he does deal with, in that process, giving you information to answer some of these specious questions of, well, you know, it was not written by that guy. It was written thousands of years or hundreds of years later. There's enough information to start the journey that you can become prepared rather than anxious. And so I'm sure there's better. And if someone's got a better book than this, I'm all for it. I'll read it. I'll encourage others to read it too. But this is a good starting point, at least.
Yeah, one of the difficulties is there's some really good resources, especially for the New Testament on this. After you've read that one, you should probably read the new book. I'll caveat that it's edited in part by a good friend of mine, John Mead, and Peter Gurry, called Myths and Mistakes in New Testament Criticism. That's kind of the next level up. There doesn't exist a lot for the Old Testament. Now, they're starting to come some things out. But there's just not a lot of space in that kind of level one, hey, I'm just getting into this. I don't know anything about it. Where should I start kind of an idea? And it's such a gap in a way that I was like, hey, someone was asking, and enough people were asking me questions about it. I was like, fine, I'll write a 1,000-word introduction, just a little bit about some of these aspects. I'll post one of those there. Like, what is this Masoretic text thing that I keep hearing about? I've written a short one on the Septuagint and other things as that nature as well, because there needs to be some introduction, because I think people are starting to get into this. I've had, in the past 2 years, which has never happened to me before in my life, multiple preachers have come and say, hey, what's the deal with this Septuagint thing? Or what's this Masoretic text? Or what's going on with the Hebrew Bible? Or what's going on? Because these questions are starting to bubble up, especially among young people from that middle school age into college age. And this is something we want to be prepared to at least have a conversation about. It doesn't mean you have to be an expert. I'm not an expert on this stuff. Let me be super clear. I am not a textual critic, but I'm at least conversant enough that we can have those conversations and say, hey, here's what I know. Here's what we don't know. Here's why I have faith in this. Here's where we can learn some more. And let's have that conversation.
Yeah, and here's another way to frame it. It's really a question of, where do you want the people you care about to get the vital information they need about vital subjects? We live in a generation, and I noticed this happening about 15 years ago as mobile devices became more and more present in life, that folks could immediately fact check anything that I was saying from the pulpit, from the Bible class. And now we're at a point where the quality of that fact checking can be extremely accurate, but it can also be extremely bad. Parents need to hear this. Your children are much more likely to Google an answer to a question than they are to come to you with answers to questions. That's the world in which we live, not the world we want to live in. It's like, this is how it is. And so, do you want them to come to you to ask questions about sexual morality? Or do you want them to go to the internet to answer those questions? Do you want, you can lay this out. And that's stuff we're going to talk about this year in Do the Work. Do you want them to talk about these questions of the reliability of the Bible to you? Or do you want them to go to Atheist 101 to get those answers?
Or Atheist Reddit.
Or the black hole of 4chan. Like, how bad do you want them to get bad information? So the better you do front-loading good facts that are really reliable things, the better you're going to be in preparing folks for those conversations, because you want them to come back to that. Hey, that wasn't written by. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Please show me your evidence and your research.
And
prove that to me.
Yeah, and on the other side, we need to be just as careful about just finding the nearest Google for apologetics website about some of these questions, because they are often horrifically out of date, 60, 70 years out of date. And if you go to this website that you trust and you answer these apologetics questions about text criticism, and they're like, hey, here's what it says, you can trust them, and then 6 months later they find out all that stuff is not true anymore, that's a crisis of faith begging to happen right there, because all of a sudden they've created the straw man, it got knocked down, now there must be no good evidence for believing in the Bible. And it's like, no, that's not true. That's a bad defense of the truth.
Yeah, and actually it's an interesting component that it's some of that old information that actually allowed Jared and I to become friends, because he pointed out that it was old bad information. I had two options. I could dismiss Jared, or I could go to him and say, tell me what I don't know. And obviously, Jared told me some things I didn't know, which is not really a surprising thing in my life. There's a lot of stuff I don't know.
Except about tacos.
I do, I do know quite a bit about tacos. But I think that's an important balance, and I think that's why my answer to that question, hey, some so and so didn't actually write that; it was written by so and so later. Show me the research. That's the answer you're actually looking for. Show the facts, and then I'm going to come back with the things that I know, and we're going to lay those together and have a conversation about it, with the caveat that, hey, you know what? There's a lot of stuff I don't know, and we don't know. Let's go together to find more together. In the end, you get to do what the Bible tells us to do, win a friend, but you also potentially cover up a multitude of sins, both immediately in these responses, your own, everything. Because again, you want that flow of relationship to go to, yeah, I can trust that the person that I love as my father or my mother or my elder or the preacher isn't just going to give me a pat answer. He's going to help me build the skills to find answers when they're gone, when I can't go to them. And that's part of that process that you're looking for. So that gives us kind of an introductory level to some of this. In regards to the typical W's of who, what, when, where, and why in teaching this, I think it's something we need to think about in this way. One of the things that probably can happen, and this is a suggestion, is that it becomes included in your textual survey classes. So if you're studying, and we'll use this as an example, 1st and 2nd Samuel, there are times where you might want to say, hey, you know what? Here's some good things to think about. Or, because I'm going to start teaching 1st and 2nd Samuel myself at Eastside on Wednesday nights. So that's why it's on the top of my head. Or if you're, and we're focusing on the Old Testament this week, digging into a passage that comes from the Psalms or Proverbs, paying attention to its historical basis, like where it comes from and who would have been impacted to it, and maybe even the culture around it in the ancient Near East, gives you stronger validity for its message. And so you can include it that way. Because I think Jared's teaching from the Proverbs right now. And so that's a space where at any age level, even down below middle school, you can talk about some of these things while not talking about translation and textual criticism, because you're giving evidence that's bigger than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something too, is I'm not saying, hey, what you need to do right now is go out and read 17,000 books on textual criticism and teach a whole class.
17,000 books needs to be read. Let's just fix part of that.
And go out and teach this whole class. But what I am saying is that we, especially those of us who preach or teach regularly, we need to be preparing ourselves now for things that are going to come up in the future. We need to have a long view of what's going on. And so maybe working on through this, and, Phil reads a new book on Old Testament criticism or something, and he's like, hey, I'm teaching through Samuel. Wow, I've got all these things in my Bible when I'm preparing this in English to say, this says this says this, what's going on? And someone in the class asks, hey, what's going on? And you can say, well, actually, because I've read this other thing, here's what's going on. And you didn't spend a whole class, 16-week thing on it. You didn't even spend a whole class period. But what you've done is you've addressed it. You've said, yes, this is a problem. Here's what we know about it. Here's what we don't know about it. Here's how you can find more. And all of a sudden, everybody there knows, okay, these things in my Bible, that's not something that causes fear. That's not something that's going to cause a crisis of faith. And we've started addressing them even now.
Yeah, and I think here's something else to kind of attach into that. That big emphasis of not being afraid of these issues, because you do not have to be a textual criticism scholar to actually introduce this subject in a quality way. And I'm not even sure that a lot of folks really would qualify to be true textual criticism scholars.
Not me.
I think that's a fairly tiny spectrum of the planet of academics. If they even exist in volume is a real question. But paying attention to these things early, again, always is better than having to react later. Further, if you try to approach this as if this isn't an issue, we can just wash it over, you are going to cause conflict in the lives of people you care about, because they will eventually be exposed to it. It will eventually come up. And it's okay. Like, it's okay to have these questions about, where did this come from? That's genuine faith-building questions. Where did we get our Bible from? I know you tell me that this Bible is God's message. How can I trust that? Now that I know that it's God's message, how can I understand the interpretation that I need from this message to build my faith, to place treasures in heaven? Like, if you really want to get that line. So middle school questions is the first layer of things that we can add now as a close of this. Middle school level, it's that table conversation. It's over the lunch table. It's a friend who says, hey, I don't think that the Bible's real. Or in their case, maybe they attend one of the Mormon churches in the community, and they've got Joseph Smith stuff as a thing attached to it. Or maybe they go from a different entire perspective, and so you need to talk about that a little bit. That's a great introductory space that maybe you're doing a class that's on comparative religions, so you can definitely include textual stuff that way. So first layer is to talk about it in the course of the study of a textual survey. Second layer might be a comparative religion Bible class, which is a great class to do at different points. It may even then fall into the third thing, which is later middle school, early high school, where you start doing true studies about evidences, where you're really honing in on matters of creation. You might even start those earlier. You're probably going to include those things when you go through Genesis and these older stories from the Old Testament. You're going to want to talk about creation. You're going to talk about God's hand in those efforts, and where does God fit in, and how does our worldview get impacted by it. And all of that can come into this process of teaching. So that's kind of bridging us into the upper high school. Do you want to, any last comments on the middle school level before we go to the high school bracket?
Middle schoolers is a bracket I don't have a lot of experience with yet. My kids are both too young, and I wasn't a Christian and wasn't involved in anything like this when I was that age. So that's kind of a black hole for me. High school is about as early as I can deal with, or unless you want to talk about like elementary school, which I've got two case studies there.
So just again, on the developmental stage of humans, middle schoolers are going through development on nitrous. Like, they are racing to the finish line in their physical development. And so a lot of emotional stuff takes into place there, which is why it's good to give them time to process things early, because they're most likely to have a strong emotional response to conflict at that point in life. High school kind of follow as the ending phase of those physical development stuff. So now they are wanting more nuanced answers. And so your answers have to be a little bit wider and explain that there are some things you don't know, and get them comfortable with ignorance. This is a time where I would probably heavily encourage the introduction of the Dunning-Kruger effect in their day-to-day brain space. And that it's okay to live within the pit of ignorance that can exist in the process of learning things. So the high school level, this is where you're going to find individuals, high school kids in particular, it seems more incentivized to pick at the faith of their friends, or acquaintances, or frenemies, or true enemies, and to disparage one another. And you're going to see an additional layer of personal animosity rise up at that point in some cases. My experience, at least. I don't know if that matches Jared's, but I know that seems to be something where you've got to kind of think through that too. Jared?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's where things start really kind of hitting the road. And this is also a time, just thinking developmentally, where a lot of kids are going to start, they may bring stuff. You've got a good relationship with your kids to your parents, but they're probably going to bring it to their friends as well and shop talk things there, and when they're bringing things to their friends about questions that may have to do with this, or their friends are bringing them to them, are they going to be able to have any basis in reality at all and how to talk about it? Now, I'm not expecting, a high school kid, get Hallie or James or something and say, hey, I need you to talk to me about this specific manuscript, right? But having some idea, if their friends come and say, hey, why do you trust that the Bible is, it's not the copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a guy written 2,000 years afterwards, and like that's printed a million times. That's not the words of Jesus. well, maybe they could say, well, you're right that it is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, but we actually have copies from 2,000 years ago, and they look very much the same. Not exactly the same. There are a lot of little differences, but those differences are by and large spelling differences. They're by and large little changes like that, and the ones that have to do with salvation are zero.
Yeah. And then I think you kind of think through this nuanced, specific layers of things to kind of respond is also become a really good listener. To listen to the question behind the question that's coming up. Some of these textual questions exist also in moral spaces at this high school level. Questions of textual conflict, not so much on the reliability of the text, but, well, the Old Testament says, but the New Testament says. Or someone told me that the Old Testament is where we find our objection to sexual activity outside of marriage, or sexual activity between different genders or same genders, and this New Testament never did. Okay, listen to that and find what is the pusher for it. Is it a friend who's struggling with their sexual preferences, identity, and desires? Is it them? Is it the child itself? Is it the person you care about? Like, work through some of that to the point where then you can gather a better understanding of what's kind of gone on that way. And so again, listen before you teach is a big plus at that middle high school to late high school edge. At late high school, it's really a time where you can start developing a better appreciation for this, to include it more regularly in your classes. Also recognizing that it's probably more important to do that and teach about general morality than it is to talk about dating to marriage. Which is probably a capstone college level course if you want to think about where it probably needs to exist, is like late college. At least my judgment. I don't know, Jared may have a different perspective.
Just teach the text in general. I had so many classes on dating, and I was like, can we just study the Bible?
Yeah.
It'll come up eventually.
Yeah. Late college seems a more statistically reliable time to teach that subject. Which moves us into the last bracket of tips to teach to kind of think through. At the college level, it kind of depends on the context of that person. And I say college, now I'm just simply talking about people who are out of high school and are not yet in the next phase of their life. And so that's going to be, people who are freshmen, sophomore academics. That's going to be people who are in trade school. Maybe they've gone to work in other capacities. Maybe they're in the military. They're going to have some nuances in these spaces, but the questions they're going to get and the comments they're going to get are going to, again, to be more specialized. You may encounter someone like my own physical brother, who is an evangelistic atheist, who has a booth on his college campus and is actively trying to undermine a person's confidence in the text. That was my brother. That's what he loved to do as a side hobby when he was in college. Obviously, at my schools, I was on a different booth. But they're going to encounter that. They're going to get people they work with who have their top 10 answers, and they'll be probably pretty polished by this point. And they're going to be fairly piercing. And so that's going to be, you're going to shift to a new level. Jared's taught at Florida College, and that's a different context. He probably deals with a different basket of questions than I've dealt with because of the nature of that environment. So let's talk about that a little bit some too, and like what should be going on at the college level or the 18 to 25-year-old. Let's use that for now, time frame.
So the thing that I've noticed is kind of like you, is that just because of our own context, where if you go out and ask 10 of your friends that you know in America, most of them are probably going to say they're Christian. And that means anybody who's not is not a Christian by accident. They're not going to be an atheist by accident. They're going to have studied themselves to some degree into that. right? And so if we're teaching these college kids, and a lot of times we are, hey, you need to be talking to your friends about Jesus. You need to be talking to your friend. You need to start evangelizing. Then they're gonna find these people who have very much prepared in these kind of anti-apologetics ways. And I use that term specifically. There are actual anti-apologists whose entire kind of career is focused on countering apologetic concerns. Well, when your kid runs into them, right, this is going to be kind of the situation. Whereas if your kid, and I don't mean your kid as in like, Jesse or somebody, or my Hadassah, right, but just this kid that you've been encouraging to go and to teach the gospel, well, they're probably not going to have the specialized answers right away to deal with these questions. But do they at least have the framework to understand and to seek out answers and how to ask questions about them, or not? Because that's kind of where we're seeing at this point. They're now early adults, and they're not going to know all the answers because we don't know all the answers. But they should have frameworks in place to know how to go and search out these answers.
Yeah, and Ruben Provost comments, what I found is that high school kids know all of the right moral answers. Should I drink? No. Should I have sex? No. Doesn't mean they live that way, but they know the answers. But even though they know some of this stuff, they don't know the Bible. And that's kind of the recurring theme that Jared and I have emphasized. Teach the text. And when you teach the text and you encounter some of these issues, don't put it at the bottom of your notes. Include it in the way that makes the most sense for the audience you're connecting to. A percentage of those kids will get enthused by that, and their faith will grow. And the hope is that those kids will enthuse the other kids around them to be concerned about that issue now. Because it's part of the bigger process you're going for. You want them to get to the point where it's not, I don't do this because Dad says not to do this. I do this because I don't believe it's the proper image of a disciple. It's the proper image of someone who is trying to be like Jesus. That's really kind of the functional end you're going for.
Yeah, and just from a very different sort of perspective too. One thing we've talked about, me, you, and I know that the other people I know have talked about as well, is that one thing that they worry about is like, well, either the Bible isn't seen as cool, or the efforts to make it cool are pretty cringeworthy in general. VBS titles in general. But one thing that some people, and not just some people, but a fair number of people, once they get into it, they think is really cool, is actually text criticism. It's like Sudoku plus a crossword puzzle plus an actual puzzle all put together. And just in terms of coolness factor, I know some people, this is actually what got them into studying the Bible at all, was actually just textual criticism. And that was the gateway drug, as it were, to becoming a Christian. Because they're like, I want to know more about this. I got into this. And now what are they doing? They're actually reading the Bible.
Yeah, you can think about it this way. We get excited. If you love professional sports, most people who love professional sports statistics, and they can quote to you the finest performances of their favorite teams and players from the last 40 years with tons of stats. Well, their win-loss percentage was influenced because this year they never kicked any field goal attempts, and so they scored an average of 0.65 more points in the game because they never, they got all that stuff. Awesome. The Bible includes, on a natural level, parts of the same stat stuff under its history. I think part of the draw to some of the really popular kind of pseudo documentaries that exist, like Tom Hanks was in the movie about one of them. The title is just ran off and moved forward.
Is this the
Dan
weird
Brown's book?
Yeah,
Dan Brown's books.
Jesus, no.
But anyway, it'll come to me in a second. Someone will comment. But they got excited about it because there was a conspiracy that they could unveil, like a mystery. Well, there's no conspiracy about textual criticism and the origin of the Bible. It's all as open as it could possibly be. And it creates just as much exciting complexity. But the neat thing is, what is revealed is not a mystery we never knew. It's a mystery we've already joined ourselves to. It's an information basket that is connected to what God has told us. And now it enriches our whole view. The Da Vinci Code. Nick came in as a savior at the end. But again, they got excited about it because there's all this, hidden information. Well, the Bible's already has a lot of that level of, I didn't know that. And now I do. And now it colors the page that was once black and white. And so things get more vibrant learning those tidbits or big facts. So at the college level again, or the 18 to 25 bracket again, this is where you're going to really hope to have seen the flowering of the seeds you planted all the way back at the middle school age, where you began to discuss these things in slightly increasing detail. And this is also where you're going to see the fruit of that work. Did you do a good job? Did the students do a good job? Because here's the tree. If the information is finally reaching the shores of the sermon, the ocean of knowledge from textual criticism kind of reaches the sand of the sermon, the Bible class, the conversation over the dinner table, you're hopefully equipping the people who are present at those events to go home and encourage the people around you who may have been asleep during your sermon. Because they may have been a 5-year-old who was exhausted. They may have been a 15-year-old who didn't care that day because their heart was more interested in things of the world, which happens. They could have been a 25-year-old who worked all that night before and did everything they could to be at services. But at services, they were just so exhausted that the best they could do was be physically present, but not mentally present. But their grandpa was there, their grandma was there, and they were taking champion level notes. That are probably better than the sermon you preached, which is just a real thing that happens in real life. And so you're trying to give them enough kernels information so when that conversation takes place, it prepares them for the conflict that is coming and is a more likely, reasonable challenge to their faith than all the ones we may imagine. Whether that comes from social media or your own devices, probably these are more realistic than the ones you've made up. I don't know about you, that's how I feel about it. So we've got a lot of folks to ask some questions. I think we handled most of them. We didn't actually get to Nick Angel's specific questions, but I'll just task Jared with responding to those later, or I'll read them again. Maybe we can add them into the chat. They were very technical in some ways, but I think we may have covered part of it.
Yeah, and I would say to Nick too, feel free, and anybody else really, if you've got any specifics, if you want more technical answers or questions, believe me, I would love to chat about them. If you're like one of the 6 people in the world who care about some of that stuff, or even want to kind of know more about it, I love talking about that stuff. I'm always happy to chat about it. Edwin had actually called me, I think it was last night, to talk about one of these things in Psalm 22. So always happy to chat about that stuff. I just don't want to drone on when most people probably aren't too excited about it.
Yeah, last week I got a question about Psalm 88 and the translation of Elohim as plural singular, and then who is the gods of 88, maybe 85. Anyway, that's it for today with our conversation with Jared about some of the aspects of the reliability of our Old Testament text. I want to thank everyone for joining in. If you've got additional questions, as always, like Jared pointed out, let us know. Next week, Jeff Wilson will be with us. Jared may or may not be actively teaching at that time. I'm not quite sure what Jared does.
I'm not sure right now either.
But we're going to be focusing heavily next week then on the New Testament, which probably is an area where folks encounter more conversation, because just as much as maybe we've experienced a generation that doesn't, Psalm 82, verse 1, we are experiencing a context where folks don't seem to know their Old Testament stories well. They tend to know their New Testament stories better. And so you're going to see more conversations, and their New Testament textual questions are more common. So Jeff's got probably a heavier load. I think Jared planned that. But we're looking forward to that next week. Thanks, everybody. And
thanks a lot. Have a great day.